All right, so today we're diving deep into communism.
Yeah, we've got a ton of sources to unpack here.
We've got a high school curriculum on communism, some historical documents, really interesting stuff.
Should be pretty fascinating.
Absolutely. Let's jump right in.
Okay.
So first up, we got to talk about the big man himself, Karl Marx, the OG communist, the guy who wrote the book on it, literally.
The Communist Manifesto, right.
Yep, the Communist Manifesto.
Yeah.
And he was all about abolishing private property.
Yeah, and he saw history as like this constant struggle between, the haves and have-nots.
The bourgeoisie and the proletariat.
Exactly. And he believed the revolution was inevitable.
Like it was going to happen no matter what.
Yeah, it was just a matter of time.
And that's where it gets a little, intense for me.
Oh, so?
Well, when I read that line in the manifesto about abolishing private property, I just thought, wait a minute. So if I, buy a new pair of shoes, they could just be taken away.
Yeah, that's a pretty radical concept.
But definitely not my style.
Makes you think about what life would be like in a Marxist society, right?
Yeah, it really does.
And the curriculum actually does a good job of contrasting Marx's ideas with figures like George Washington and Martin Luther King Jr.
Who are all about individual rights and freedoms.
Exactly. A very different perspective.
That's a pretty stark difference, right?
For sure. You've got Washington advocating for limited government, and then you have Marx calling for a complete overthrow of the existing social order.
And not just overthrowing it, but he was advocating for violent revolution.
Yeah, he believed that violence was necessary to achieve his goals.
So what does that tell us about the foundation of communist ideology?
I think it shows that from the very beginning, it was intertwined with this idea of force and coercion.
Interesting.
And that leads us nicely to Lenin and the Bolsheviks in Russia.
Yes. Lenin, the guy who actually put Marx's ideas into practice.
Yeah, he took those theories and turned them into a reality.
And the curriculum paints this really vivid picture of those early days of Bolshevik rule.
What's it like?
You see these everyday Russians, a priest, a student, a countess, all struggling to navigate this new world where everything they knew was being turned upside down.
So, what were their lives actually like?
Well, Lenin's goal was to create this workers' paradise, but his methods were brutal.
Brutal in what sense?
He nationalized industries, abolished private property, and he got rid of anyone who stood in his way.
Got rid of?
Eliminated them.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the curriculum actually quotes Lenin calling his enemies harmful insects.
Harmful insects? That's pretty dehumanizing.
Yeah, it's chilling stuff.
So what was the human cost of building this so-called workers' paradise?
It was massive. The source material highlights that between 1917 and 1923, over 200,000 people were executed by the Bolsheviks.
Oh, my God.
And that's not even counting the estimated 300,000 who died from executions, imprisonment, and forced relocation.
Wow, so those numbers are just from the first few years after the revolution.
Exactly.
That's staggering.
It really makes you think, can any ideology, any idea justify that level of suffering?
That's the question, isn't it? The clash between ideology and reality, the promise of a utopian future versus the brutal methods used to try and achieve it.
And speaking of brutal, let's talk about Stalin.
Ah, yes. Stalin. He took Lenin's playbook and turned the dial up to 11.
Yeah, this guy was all about control and manipulation.
How so?
He used propaganda to create this cult of personality around himself, making himself out to be this benevolent father figure.
While behind the scenes, he was orchestrating mass terror and repression.
Exactly. The curriculum actually includes a copy of a propaganda poster.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it shows Stalin surrounded by these happy, smiling children.
It's kind of ironic, right?
It's almost comical when you compare it to the reality of his regime.
Yeah, so what was the reality like?
It was horrific. The curriculum goes into detail about his forced collectivization of agriculture.
What was that all about?
It was this policy where he basically took away private land ownership and forced farmers to work on collective farms.
And what was the outcome of that?
Disaster. It led to widespread famine, especially in Ukraine.
How many people are we talking about here?
Millions died because of this policy.
Millions. That's just unbelievable.
It's truly heartbreaking to read accounts from that time.
I can imagine.
The curriculum actually quotes Stalin as saying, "Death solves all problems. No man, no problem."
No man, no problem. Wow, that's a chilling insight into his mindset.
It really is.
So, beyond collectivization, what else was going on under Stalin?
Well, there's the Gulag.
The Gulag.
Yeah, this vast network of forced labor camps where he sent anyone who opposed him.
What was it like in these camps?
Brutal. The conditions were horrific. Prisoners were worked to death.
Wow.
The source material actually quotes a prisoner recalling that guards would shoot them like dogs.
If they challenged them or disobeyed,
Yeah.
that's just inhumane.
The scale of suffering under Stalin is just mind-boggling.
How many people were affected by this?
Millions were imprisoned, executed, or simply vanished.
Vanished.
Yeah, they just disappeared, never to be seen again.
It's crazy that even today, some people still defend Stalin, claiming he was a great leader.
I know, it's wild, right?
It's a testament to the power of propaganda,
And how easily people can be manipulated.
especially when they're desperate for change or a better future.
Now let's shift focus to a specific region that really felt the full force of Stalin's regime. The Baltic states.
The Baltic states.
Yeah, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia.
What happened there?
Well, before World War II, they were independent nations.
But after the war, they were forcibly absorbed into the Soviet Union.
And that's when things took a really dark turn.
In what way?
We have these primary source documents,
Primary source documents, what do you mean?
like actual orders from the Soviet secret police.
Oh, wow.
They outline the deportation of Baltic citizens to Siberia.
Deportation to Siberia. That sounds brutal.
It was. These documents are chilling. They lay out the entire process.
Like, what kind of process are we talking about?
Rounding up families, confiscating their belongings, shipping them off to labor camps thousands of miles away.
Thousands of miles away.
Yeah, to the middle of nowhere.
That's just heartbreaking.
The level of detail in these documents is incredible.
What do you mean by detail?
There were even instructions on how to separate families without letting them know they're being split up.
Without letting them know. That's so cruel.
It's like something straight out of a dystopian novel.
I can't even imagine the trauma.
It's just horrifying.
So who exactly was targeted for these deportations?
The curriculum has these deportees character cards that give you a sense of who is affected.
Like, what kind of people?
There's a plumber, a logging company owner, a former prime minister.
So a real cross-section of society.
Yeah, even a 12-year-old boy.
A 12-year-old boy.
It's just awful.
It really highlights that these weren't just statistics. They were real people with families and lives.
Exactly. They had hopes and dreams, and their lives were shattered by the Soviet state.
It's hard to grasp the level of cruelty involved in these deportations.
It really is.
And tragically, many of these people never saw their homes or families again.
They perished in the harsh conditions of the Gulag, victims of a system that saw them as expendable.
Expendable, it's hard to even process that.
You have to wonder, how can any ideology justify that kind of suffering?
It's a question we should definitely keep in mind as we go deeper into this deep dive.
Sure.
Speaking of going deeper, our next stop takes us to Asia.
Asia.
Yeah, where Mao Zedong was implementing his own brand of communism in China.
Ah, Chairman Mao.
And this is where the curriculum gets kind of funny.
Funny. How so?
They have this activity where they use jelly beans.
Jelly beans? Seriously?
No, right? Sounds a little ridiculous.
It does.
But it's actually a really clever way to illustrate the concept of forced collectivization and redistribution of wealth.
Oh, okay. I'm intrigued. Tell me more about this jelly bean revolution.
So imagine you give everyone 10 jelly beans,
Okay, I'm imagining it.
and then they're all taken back and redistributed equally.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Of course, some people gobble theirs up right away, while others try to save them, but it doesn't matter.
Because the teacher, acting as the all-powerful state, confiscates them all.
Exactly. And then everyone gets, say, 2 each.
2 each, regardless of how many they started with or how many they ate.
The point is to make you feel that frustration of having your property taken away.
Even if it's just candy.
Exactly. It's a simplified way to show how Mao's policies played out in real life.
So Mao was all about eliminating individualism and promoting the collective good.
Yeah, he believed that individual desires should be subservient to the needs of the state.
And that's what led to the Great Leap Forward, right?
Right, this grand plan to rapidly industrialize the country and collectivize agriculture.
But it didn't exactly go as planned, did it?
It was a catastrophic failure.
A complete disaster.
It led to widespread famine, with estimates of the death toll ranging from tens of millions to over 40 million people.
40 million.
Yeah, it's hard to even fathom the scale of the suffering.
And then came the Cultural Revolution.
The Cultural Revolution, that was Mao's purge of anyone he saw as a threat, right?
Yeah, he unleashed the Red Guard, these young fanatical supporters who terrorize anyone who didn't fit Mao's vision.
Who were the targets of this terror?
Intellectuals, artists, anyone with ties to the old ways.
That's old way.
Like traditional Chinese culture, or even just having a different opinion.
So it was about controlling thoughts as much as actions.
Exactly. The curriculum actually has these scenarios where students role-played people caught up in the Cultural Revolution.
What kind of scenarios?
Like a university student pressured to join the Red Guard, a high school teacher forced to work on a farm, a Buddhist monk trying to save his temple from destruction.
It's a really creative way to help students understand the human impact of these events.
It really personalizes the history.
And it makes you realize how easily people can be swept up in these movements, even when they know it's wrong.
It's pretty scary, actually.
It is. It shows the dangers of unchecked ideology.
And here's the irony. Mao was obsessed with purging capitalist influences. But his methods, the mass mobilization, the forced labor, kind of mirrored the very system he claimed to oppose.
That's a really interesting point. It seems like sometimes the lines between the systems you're fighting against and the systems you create can get blurred.
For sure. And from China, our journey takes us to another land of contradictions, North Korea, under the Kim dynasty.
Ah, the Kims. They've taken the idea of a great leader to a whole new level.
It's like they've created this system where the Kim family is worshipped as gods.
What's it actually like to live there?
Well, the curriculum talks about this concept of juche.
Juche.
Yeah, it's this North Korean ideology of self-reliance.
Self-reliance.
Yeah, the idea that North Korea can achieve anything on its own without needing help from the outside world.
So it's like this extreme form of nationalism.
Exactly. And juche is drilled into their citizens through constant propaganda.
What kind of propaganda are we talking about?
The massive choreographed spectacles called the Arirang Mass Games.
The airing mass games? What are those?
Imagine thousands of people performing these intricate routines that create giant images of the Kims and other North Korean symbols.
Wow, that sounds intense.
It's like living in a world where every thought you have is dictated by the state.
And any deviation from the official line can land you in prison, right?
Or worse.
So what happens to those who dissent?
The curriculum mentions Camp 22.
Camp 22?
It's this political prison camp where an estimated 50,000 people are held.
50,000.
Yeah. And the conditions are horrific: torture, starvation, forced labor.
It sounds like a nightmare.
And it gets even worse. They don't just punish the individual.
What do?
They punish their entire family,
Their entire family.
going back generations.
Wow, that's unbelievable.
It's like living in this giant open-air prison.
And what's even more chilling is that many people are so indoctrinated they don't even realize they're being oppressed.
Yeah, they genuinely believe they're living in paradise thanks to the Kims.
It's a perfect example of the psychological manipulation that can happen under a totalitarian regime.
It's not just about physical control. It's about controlling minds and perceptions.
Which is much harder to break free from.
It's a really sobering thought.
It is. And speaking of sobering, that leads us to one of the darkest chapters in human history. The Cambodian genocide under Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge.
This is heavy stuff.
It is. The Cambodian genocide is a stark reminder of the horrors that can unfold when ideology is taken to its extreme.
The curriculum refers to it as Year Zero.
Year Zero. Why is that?
Because Pol Pot wanted to erase the past, to start from scratch.
Start from scratch.
He wanted to create a new Cambodia based on his vision of a utopian agrarian society.
So what was his vision exactly?
He envisioned a society without money, without religion, without anything that he considered corrupting.
Sounds pretty radical.
It was, and anyone who didn't fit into this vision was eliminated.
Eliminated meaning?
Killed. The curriculum actually quotes Pol Pot as saying, "To keep you is no benefit. To destroy you is no loss."
That's chilling.
It really shows the dehumanization that happened under the Khmer Rouge.
They saw people as obstacles to be overcome rather than human beings.
And their methods were horrifyingly efficient.
What kind of methods did they use?
Mass executions, starvation, disease.
They used it all to eliminate anyone they considered a threat.
Millions of Cambodians perished.
Millions.
The curriculum talks about the killing fields, these mass graves where the victims were buried.
They were just dumped into mass graves.
It's a horrifying thought.
It's almost unimaginable.
They even have an activity where students participate in a simulated war crimes trial of a Khmer Rouge official.
A simulated trial. That's an interesting approach.
Yeah, the testimonies from the witnesses are absolutely gut-wrenching.
I bet.
It's hard to even read about it without feeling sick to your stomach.
So what happened to Pol Pot? Was he ever held accountable for his crimes?
Sadly, no. He died in 1998 before he could be tried for genocide.
So he escaped justice.
He did. It's a reminder that sometimes the perpetrators of the worst atrocities never face consequences.
That's a really hard pill to swallow.
It is. But let's shift gears a bit, shall we, to a slightly less depressing corner of the communist world. Cuba.
Cuba?
Yeah, Cuba, under Fidel Castro.
I feel like Cuba is often romanticized as this beacon of revolution.
Yeah, a lot of people see Castro and Che Guevara as these heroic figures,
But the reality is a lot more complicated.
for sure. The curriculum does a good job of debunking some of the myths surrounding Castro and Che.
How so?
They show that iconic Che Guevara poster.
The one with the beret and the steely gaze.
Exactly. And they ask students to analyze it and then discuss what they know about Che's role in the Cuban Revolution.
So what do they learn?
They learned that he wasn't just some charismatic revolutionary. He was actually responsible for the execution of countless people.
Oh, wow. So the image doesn't quite match the reality.
Not at all.
Hmm.
And the curriculum goes even further. They compare and contrast the views of Castro, Che, and John F. Kennedy on things like liberty, revolution, and democracy.
That's an interesting comparison.
They even had this visual where they put quotes from each figure on a spectrum.
A spectrum.
Yeah, with those opposing democracy on one end and those supporting it on the other.
So where did Castro fall on that spectrum?
Well, he's famous for saying, if a person has a good word for the previous government, that is good enough for me to have him shot.
That's a pretty extreme statement.
Yeah, it's a stark contrast to JFK's famous line, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Two very different perspectives on leadership and the role of the individual.
And it's not just about words, it's about actions.
Right. What did Castro actually do once he was in power?
Well, he turned Cuba into a one-party state, suppressed dissent, imprisoned opponents, and nationalized industries.
So not exactly a democracy.
He promised a democratic Cuba, but what he delivered was a communist dictatorship.
And how did Castro's revolution impact the rest of the world?
It inspired communist movements throughout Latin America, leading to decades of conflict and instability.
So his actions had ripple effects far beyond Cuba.
The curriculum also highlights the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Ah, yes, the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the world came dangerously close to nuclear war.
All because of Castro's alliance with the Soviet Union.
It shows how the Cold War really played out on a global scale, with smaller nations often caught in the crossfire.
Speaking of the Cold War, let's talk about one of its most iconic symbols, the Berlin Wall.
The Berlin Wall, a physical manifestation of the ideological divide between East and West.
The curriculum does a great job of setting the stage by describing the division of Germany after World War II.
And then they actually divide the classroom in half, right?
Yeah, they literally create a physical barrier in the classroom.
Wow. That's a really creative way to help students connect with the experience.
They even have a bag of candy that they only give to one side of the room.
To represent the differences in living standards between East and West Berlin.
It's a really powerful visual representation of the economic consequences of communism.
So they get to experience the division firsthand.
And then there's the wall itself.
The wall.
Yeah, the curriculum has these striking photos, the barbed wire, the guard towers, the desperate attempts to escape.
It's a stark reminder of the human cost of this ideological struggle.
People were killed trying to escape, families were torn apart, lives were destroyed.
All because of a wall.
A wall that symbolized the suppression of freedom.
It's hard to believe that something like that could exist in the 20th century.
But eventually, the Berlin Wall came down.
In 1989, a truly momentous event.
It was a symbol of hope, a sign that change was possible.
And it marked a turning point in the Cold War, the beginning of the end for the Soviet Empire.
Which brings us to our final stop on this whirlwind tour of the communist world, America's involvement in Vietnam.
The Vietnam War, a complex and controversial conflict.
The curriculum focuses on the human cost of the war, especially for American prisoners of war.
It's important to remember the sacrifices made by those who served.
They have this incredible story about Admiral Edward Holmes Martin.
Admiral Martin.
He was captured by the North Vietnamese and held prisoner for 6 years.
6 years. That's a long time.
He endured torture, solitary confinement, unimaginable hardship.
It's hard to even imagine what he went through.
The curriculum actually includes a transcript of an interview with him, where he describes his experiences in chilling detail.
That must be a tough read.
It is, but it's also a testament to human resilience.
It's amazing what people can endure.
The curriculum also touches on the impact of the war back home.
We knew.
The protests, the divisions, the psychological scars that many veterans carried with them long after the fighting ended.
The war had a profound impact on American society.
Yeah, it's a sobering reminder that the cost of war is measured not just in lives lost, but in lives forever changed.
A cost that continues to be paid long after the guns fall silent.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have, from the theories of Marx to the realities of communist regimes around the world.
It's been a fascinating albeit heavy, journey.
But an important one.
Absolutely.
I think it's crucial to understand this history so that we can learn from the mistakes of the past.
And hopefully make better choices in the future.
Exactly.
So before we wrap up this part of our deep dive,
Yeah.
I want to leave you with this thought. The legacy of communism is complex and challenging.
It certainly is.
But it's a history we can't afford to ignore.
We need to grapple with these ideas, even the uncomfortable ones.
Because if we don't learn from the past, we're doomed to repeat it.
Your wise words.
Now, let's shift gears and head to Eastern Europe,
Okay.
where the captive nations were struggling to break free from Soviet control.
I'm ready when you are.
So before the break, we were talking about the Vietnam War and, its impact on America. But across the world, Eastern Europe was trapped behind the Iron Curtain, living under communist regimes that the Soviet Union had basically imposed on them. It's like crazy to think about what life must have been like for them.
Yeah, imagine it. Living in Eastern Europe during the Cold War. You're living under this system that controls everything from, the jobs you can have to even what you can say. And this goes on for decades.
The source material calls these countries captive nations.
Which is a very fitting term. They had basically lost all their freedom and independence.
And it wasn't just a political takeover, right? The Soviets, actively tried to wipe out the local cultures, the local traditions, and replace them with their own communist ideology.
Absolutely. They came in, imposed their own economic policies, nationalized industries, collectivized agriculture, and a lot of times this led to some pretty bad consequences.
Yeah, the curriculum has this graphic organizer that tracks the impact of Soviet rule on these different Eastern European countries. And it's really striking how similar their experiences were: the suppression of dissent, the political prisons, just the economic hardships.
It's like a blueprint for how to control a population. But even in these conditions, that desire for freedom, it never really went away.
And that kind of brings us to one of the most fascinating parts of this whole story: the role of nonviolent resistance in the eventual collapse of communism.
Yeah, people found ways to resist, to hold on to their own cultural identity, to keep that hope alive.
And the curriculum highlights how important music and poetry were in this resistance. There's this whole section on national anthems becoming these rallying cries for freedom.
Imagine that. A world where singing your own national anthem could get you arrested or even killed. That was the reality for people in Eastern Europe.
They sang anyway, though, right?
They did, in secret, in churches, in their own homes, and eventually they sang out in the streets.
One really powerful example is the singing revolution in Estonia.
Oh yeah, the singing revolution.
They used these massive song festivals, huge gatherings where thousands of people would come together to sing these patriotic songs.
Powerful. A way to express their national pride and defiance. It's amazing how something as simple as singing could have such a huge political impact.
It's pretty incredible. And then there's the Baltic Way.
The Baltic Way, that human chain.
Yeah, that human chain that stretched over 400 miles, connecting the capitals of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania.
2 million people, hand in hand, singing their national anthems, demanding freedom. Just the sheer scale of it is hard to wrap your head around.
It's a testament to the power of peaceful protest and that just unwavering human desire for self-determination.
And that spirit of resistance, it wasn't just limited to the Baltic states.
Right. The curriculum talks about uprisings in Hungary and Czechoslovakia movements that were brutally crushed, but still showed how fragile the Soviet system really was.
Exactly. Like the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, the Soviets sent tanks in to crush the uprising. Brutal. But even though it failed, it showed that they couldn't just silence people with violence.
Then you have the Prague Spring in 1968, another attempt to reform communism from within.
And once again, the Soviets responded with tanks, a harsh crackdown. But something shifted after Prague Spring. The world was watching, and the brutality of that Soviet response, it really tarnished their image on the global stage.
It's like people started to see the cracks in the facade, so the tide was starting to turn. But it wasn't just these protests and uprisings that weakened the Soviet Union.
Right. The Soviet system, it was crumbling from within. Their economy was a mess. Their ideology was losing its appeal, and their leadership was getting old, out of touch.
And then Gorbachev came along.
Mikhail Gorbachev, the reformer, came to power in the mid-1980s and really shook things up.
He introduced perestroika, restructuring the economy, and glasnost openness.
Yeah, he wanted to save communism, but his reforms actually ended up speeding up its demise.
It's kind of ironic, isn't it? Like, trying to fix something and accidentally breaking it even more.
Yeah, exactly. By opening up the system, allowing more freedom of expression, Gorbachev unleashed forces that he couldn't control. It's like trying to patch up a dam that's already overflowing.
And the captive nations of Eastern Europe were ready to break free.
And that's exactly what happened. One by one, the communist regimes collapsed. Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania, it was like a domino effect.
Each one falling and inspiring the next. And finally, on December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union itself dissolved.
It was over. The captive nations were free. The Cold War was over. Hard to believe it all happened in just a few short years. History is wild like that.
But even though the Soviet Union is gone, that legacy of communism, it's still with us, isn't it?
Absolutely. We see it in the ongoing struggles for freedom and democracy in places like Cuba, North Korea. It's a reminder that we need to be vigilant to defend those values wherever they're threatened.
So where do we go from here? What lessons can we learn from all of this, from this deep dive into history of communism? So we've talked about a lot, haven't we?
Yeah, we've really gone deep.
From Marxist theories to the realities of these communist regimes all over the globe. Fascinating stuff, really.
It's been heavy too, though, right?
Yeah, no doubt. As we wrap things up, what do you think are the key takeaways? What should we be thinking about?
It's interesting because even with all the failures, there's still this appeal, this allure to communist ideals.
Why do you think that is? I mean, after
Right.
seeing what happened, what makes these ideas still attractive to some people?
Well, at its heart, communism promises fairness, right? A world where everyone's equal, where no one's left behind. That's a powerful vision, especially for people who feel like the current system isn't working for them.
I get that, the desire for a better world. But as we've seen, the path to that utopia, it's often paved with good intentions that just go terribly wrong.
Yeah, trying to eliminate inequality often creates new forms of inequality, new forms of oppression. Give all the power to the state, and you inevitably end up suppressing individual freedoms.
Like the ends don't justify the means.
Exactly. And that's such an important lesson, for today. We need to be careful about those utopian promises.
Question everything.
Yeah, think critically. Challenge those who are trying to grab more power, consolidate power.
So it's not just about looking back. It's about applying these lessons to the world we live in right now.
For sure. How can we use this knowledge to do better, to make sure we don't repeat the mistakes of the past?
Right. What can we actually learn from all of this?
Freedom's fragile. We got to be vigilant to protect it. We got to find ways to, address injustice and inequality, but without sacrificing individual liberty, human dignity.
It's a tough balance, that collective good versus individual freedom.
It is, and it requires, constant dialogue, critical thinking, being willing to really, really engage with these complex issues.
Well, this has been a truly eye-opening look into the world of communism, that's for sure.
It has.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Appreciate it.
We hope you learned a lot and that you'll continue to explore these ideas, think about how they still influence our world today.
Yeah, because the legacy of communism, it's still with us.
And understanding it is crucial, I think, to navigating the future.
Absolutely.